"Those shoes look like they've walked through hell and back," Victoria Hayes announced with crystalline cruelty as she gestured toward Julian Carter's worn leather Oxfords during the Sterling Enterprises charity gala, her voice carrying across the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, where 400 of Manhattan's wealthiest had gathered to celebrate their own generosity, while a black custodial worker cleared their champagne glasses wearing footwear that told stories none of them would ever understand. The shoes were indeed worn, leather creased and faded in patterns that suggested thousands of miles walked, soles carefully resoled multiple times. The original deep mahogany color now muted to something between rust and earth, but maintained with such meticulous care that even their deterioration possessed dignity that wealth could never purchase. Julian felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied any attention to the shoes, not because they embarrassed him, but because every scuff mark represented a memory he couldn't bear to lose. The hospital corridors during Maya's treatments, the cemetery path he walked every Sunday, the elementary school playground where she had laughed in her matching pair before leukemia had stolen her laughter forever. "Ma'am, I apologize if my appearance doesn't meet your standards," Julian replied quietly, his voice carrying the controlled dignity that 38 years of navigating white spaces had taught him was essential for survival, even as something ancient and wounded twisted behind his ribs where grief lived like permanent scar tissue. At 38, Julian possessed the kind of invisible expertise that characterized artisans whose hands had created beauty for others while their own lives crumbled into ash. His fingers still remembered the precise tension needed for stitching leather, the exact angle for cutting patterns, the patient rhythm of craftsmanship that had once made him the most sought-after custom shoemaker in 3 continents before medical bills and grief had reduced his world to cleaning supplies and memories, worn into leather. "Standards," Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and performative as she played to her audience of hedge fund managers and pharmaceutical heirs whose net worth exceeded small nations' GDP. "Those shoes should be in a museum documenting poverty, not walking across floors that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent." The cruelty was both casual and calculated, the kind that wealthy people deployed when they needed to reassert hierarchy through public humiliation, transforming human dignity into entertainment for crowds whose comfort depended on maintaining clear boundaries between those who served and those who were served. But the laughter that Victoria expected from her audience never materialized. Instead, Marcus Dubois, a 72-year-old French billionaire whose art collection included Picassos and Rothkos, whose wine cellar housed bottles worth more than luxury cars, whose eye for beauty had made him legendary among collectors who understood the true value transcended price tags, stood abruptly from his table with an expression that made the entire ballroom hold its breath. "Mon Dieu," Marcus whispered, moving toward Julian with the careful reverence that art collectors used when encountering masterpieces they had thought lost to history. "Those are Carter originals." The name fell into the ballroom like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition among guests old enough to remember when Julian Carter's custom shoemaking had represented the absolute pinnacle of artisanal luxury. When celebrities waited 3 years for his creations, when his workshop in Brooklyn had been featured in Vogue and GQ, when wearing Carter originals had been a status symbol that money alone couldn't purchase because Julian had chosen his clients based on whether he respected their character rather than their bank accounts. "I don't understand," Victoria said, her confident mockery fracturing into confusion as she watched Marcus kneel before Julian with the kind of respect that billionaires rarely showed anyone, let alone custodial workers at charity galas. "These shoes," Marcus continued, his French accent thickening with emotion as he examined Julian's worn Oxfords with the focused intensity that collectors brought to authentication of priceless artifacts. were made by hands that created footwear for princes and presidents, for artists and philosophers, for anyone whose soul possessed beauty that matched their willingness to wait for perfection. "I own 7 pairs of Carter Originals," Marcus announced to the now silent ballroom, his voice carrying both reverence and reproach. Each pair cost between $15,000 and $30,000, and each pair was worth every cent, because they were made by an artisan whose understanding of leather and form transcended mere craftsmanship to become art that you could wear. The silence that followed was absolute. The kind that occurred when comfortable assumptions about social hierarchy shattered in real time. When wealth realized it had just revealed its ignorance. When cruelty discovered it had attacked something sacred. "But these shoes," Marcus continued, his voice breaking slightly as he traced the careful repairs that Julian had made over years of wear, "these shoes tell stories that no amount of money could commission. See here?" He pointed to a section where the leather had been reinforced, with stitching so precise it was nearly invisible. "This repair work is flawless, suggesting the maker values these shoes beyond their monetary worth." And here, Marcus indicated wear patterns that showed thousands of miles walked. The gait pattern suggests someone who walked with purpose and pain, probably visiting the same places repeatedly over years, maintaining these shoes through care that transforms utility into devotion. Victoria felt something cold settling in her stomach as she looked down at her own shoes, custom Italian heels that had cost $15,000 and that she had purchased without thought because the price tag had seemed appropriate for someone of her status. "Ms. Hayes," Marcus said, his voice carrying aristocratic reproach that made Victoria's inherited wealth seem suddenly inadequate, "you are wearing Carter Originals on your feet right now. Those shoes were likely commissioned by someone who understood their value, and you've been walking in masterpieces created by the same hands that made the Poverty Museum pieces you just mocked." The revelation hit Victoria like physical violence as she stared at her expensive heels, seeing for the first time the tiny signature burned into the insole that she had never noticed. J. Carter, Brooklyn, 2016, the year before her father had died of the heart attack that had transferred sterling enterprises into her unprepared hands. "These shoes," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible as memory flooded back. "My father bought these for my birthday. He said they were made by the finest craftsman in America, someone who made shoes that would outlast any relationship or career because they were built with integrity that modern manufacturing had forgotten." Your father had excellent taste," Marcus replied, his voice softening slightly. "Julian Carter's work has that effect. He makes objects that carry meaning beyond their function because he understands that the things we wear every day become part of our stories." As Victoria processed the magnitude of her public cruelty towards someone whose artistry she had literally been standing on, Julian remained silent, his hands steady as he held the cleaning supplies that represented his current employment, while his past reputation reconstructed itself in real time through Marcus's testimony and collective recognition. "Mr. Carter?" Victoria finally managed, her voice stripped of its earlier cruelty and replaced by something that might have been genuine shame. "I apologize for my comments about your shoes. I didn't understand." "Ma'am, you couldn't have understood," Julian interrupted quietly, his voice carrying dignity that privilege could never purchase. "Because these shoes don't represent poverty or lack of standards. They represent the last thing I made with my daughter before she died of leukemia at age 10, and every step I take in them is a step she's still taking with me. The ballroom silence transformed from shocked to sacred as 400 wealthy guests confronted that they had just witnessed not merely class mockery, but the desecration of a father's grief memorial, and that the shoes they had been taught to view as markers of poverty were actually artifacts of love, more valuable than anything their wealth could commission. Some moments of discovery reveal that the things we mock from positions of privilege carry stories that could teach us everything we never knew we needed to learn about dignity, artistry, and the difference between price and value. And sometimes those lessons arrive through public shame that forces us to see that we've been walking in masterpieces while mocking the masters. The viral video that would ultimately change multiple lives began uploading to social media platforms at 11:52 p.m. that same night, as charity gala attendees shared footage of the most devastating moment of accountability ever witnessed at a Manhattan social event, without understanding that they were broadcasting the resurrection of an artisan whose grief had made his extraordinary past seem less important than his present survival. Julian sat in his small Brooklyn apartment at 1:30 a.m., staring at his phone as notifications exploded with messages from former clients, luxury brands, and fashion journalists who had thought he had died or disappeared. Now discovering that he had been working as a custodial employee while maintaining shoes that represented his last physical connection to Maya. "Papa, why are people saying mean things about the pretty lady?" came a sleepy voice from the doorway. Not Maya, because Maya had been gone for 8 years. But her memory was so vivid in this apartment that sometimes Julian could almost hear her questions about the adult world she would never navigate. The apartment itself was a shrine disguised as living space. Photographs of Maya covered every surface, her small shoes displayed on a shelf like museum pieces, her drawings still magnetized to the refrigerator, alongside school reports showing straight A's that had meant nothing when leukemia had decided her intelligence didn't matter compared to mutated cells that modern medicine couldn't stop. Despite $250,000 in treatments that had consumed Julian's business, savings, and future. Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes was experiencing her own crisis at 2:01 a.m. as she sat in her late father's study, the room she had preserved exactly as he'd left it when his heart attack had stolen him 3 years ago. Holding the Carter original shoes that had been his last gift to her, finally reading the note he had left with them that she had never bothered to open because birthday presents from wealthy fathers seemed less important than board meetings and quarterly reports. "Victoria," her father's handwriting read, "these shoes were made by a man named Julian Carter, who understands that the things we create with our hands carry more meaning than the things we purchase with our money. He told me these shoes would last longer than my life, and he was right. When you wear them, remember that true value isn't measured in price tags, but in the care someone takes to create something beautiful that will outlast them. Learn from this man's artistry what I failed to teach you about dignity and purpose." The words hit Victoria like archaeological discovery of her father's disappointment. He had known even then that she was becoming exactly the kind of privileged heir who would mock worn shoes while wearing masterpieces, who would confuse wealth with worth, who would need public humiliation to learn what he had tried teaching through gentle example and carefully chosen gifts. As dawn approached, Elena Santos, Victoria's executive assistant, who had been working at Sterling Enterprises for 7 years, arrived at the office for an emergency meeting that would either expose or protect institutional knowledge about Julian's past that Elena had been keeping secret since the day she had recognized him during his job interview. "Victoria, I need to tell you something about Julian Carter that you should have known before last night," Elena said, her voice carrying the controlled anxiety that characterized employees about to reveal that they had been concealing information from their employer for years. "Elena, what could you possibly tell me that would be worse than discovering I publicly mocked a grieving father while wearing shoes his hands created?" Victoria replied, though her defensive tone suggested growing awareness that her ignorance extended beyond last night's specific cruelty. "Julian applied for the custodial position 7 years ago using his real name and real resume that included his shoemaking career," Elena explained, placing the original employment application on Victoria's desk. HR rejected him because they said someone with his qualifications was overqualified for the position and likely looking for lawsuit opportunities. So you hired him anyway? Victoria asked, processing information that suggested her company's employment practices included systematic discrimination against qualified applicants whose expertise made HR uncomfortable. I hired him as a favor to myself, Elena replied, her voice carrying complexity that workplace hierarchies usually suppressed. Because Julian Carter made shoes for my wedding 15 years ago, and when my husband died 2 years later, Julian sent me a letter saying that the shoes had been designed to last longer than any marriage because quality craftsmanship outlives human relationships, but that the artistry we experience during those relationships makes our grief more beautiful. The revelation transformed Julian from victim of Victoria's cruelty into someone whose artistic philosophy had provided comfort during Elena's widowhood, whose understanding of grief and beauty had made him valuable to people whose losses transcended his ability to fix or prevent them. Elena, why didn't you tell me any of this? Victoria asked, though the question's real meaning was, why didn't you protect me from my own ignorance? Because you never asked about the custodial staff, Elena replied with the gentle honesty that long-term employees learned for telling executives truths they didn't want to hear. Julian has worked here for 7 years, and you've walked past him hundreds of times without seeing him as anything other than invisible service labor that your privilege allows you to ignore until you need someone to humiliate for your guests' entertainment. The assessment was both accurate and devastating, forcing Victoria to confront that her father's fears about her character had been justified. She had become exactly the kind of privileged heir who measured people's worth by their current employment rather than their complete humanity, who had learned to see service workers as interchangeable rather than as individuals with expertise and histories that could teach her everything her inheritance had failed to provide. Over the following days, as media coverage transformed the viral video from social justice content into human interest story about grief, artistry, and class dynamics, Julian faced impossible choices about whether accepting renewed fame and commission offers would honor or betray Maya's memory that had been most sacred when it remained private rather than becoming public consumption. Mr. Carter, I have 17 commission requests from clients willing to pay between $50,000 and $100,000 for custom shoes, reported his former business manager Sarah Kim during their phone conversation. The waiting list is already at 43 people, and luxury brands are offering 6-figure contracts for consulting and design work. Maya died because I spent so much time making shoes for wealthy clients that I missed the early symptoms of her leukemia, Julian replied, his voice carrying guilt that 8 years of therapy hadn't eliminated. Going back to that work feels like choosing the same priorities that killed her. But Julian, Maya died because childhood leukemia is devastating regardless of parental attention, Sarah countered, using the clinical logic that grief counselors had been repeating for years. And the medical bills that destroyed your business came from trying to save her life, not from neglecting her health. The conversation revealed how grief had transformed Julian's understanding of his past choices into evidence of failure, rather than allowing him to recognize that tragedy had occurred despite rather than because of his dedication to both craft and family. Some moral choices require understanding that public accountability for cruelty can create opportunities that feel like exploitation of the very grief that made the cruelty devastating, and that deciding whether to accept renewed success means confronting whether healing requires sharing our losses or protecting them from becoming commodified through others' consumption of our pain. 4 weeks after the viral video had resurrected Julian Carter's reputation while exposing Victoria Hayes's cruelty to a global audience of 12 million viewers, Julian stood in his former Brooklyn workshop, now owned by a coffee roasting company, staring at the exact spot where Maya had sat on her special stool, watching him work while asking endless questions about why leather had grain patterns and whether shoes could tell stories about the people who wore them. "Papa, if you make someone really good shoes, does that mean they'll have good adventures?" Maya had asked during one of their last conversations before chemotherapy had stolen her energy for workshop visits. Her 10-year-old logic connecting craftsmanship with destiny in ways that Julian's adult understanding knew were impossible, but wished were true. The memory was so vivid that Julian could almost smell the leather conditioning oil that had been Maya's favorite scent, could almost hear her laugh when he let her hammer brass eyelets into practice pieces, could almost feel her small hand in his as they walked home wearing their matching Carter originals that had been designed to last decades but had only carried her through one perfect year. "Mr. Carter, the landlord is asking if you want to tour the space for potential workshop restoration," said his attorney, David Chen, whose voice carried the careful optimism that professionals used when clients faced decisions about rebuilding lives that grief had demolished. "The coffee company's lease expires in 60 days, and the owner remembers your work and would offer favorable rental terms. David, opening this workshop again means accepting that Maya's death didn't have to end my career, which feels like admitting I chose grief over healing for 8 years, Julian replied, his voice carrying the exhaustion that characterized people whose survival strategies had become prisons they couldn't escape. "But Julian, maintaining your grief doesn't honor Maya's memory, it just punishes you for surviving her," David countered with the blunt honesty that long-term professional relationships sometimes permitted. "She loved watching you create beautiful things. Stopping that work didn't bring her back, it just made the world less beautiful." The assessment forced Julian to confront whether his custodial work had been practical necessity or self-imposed penance for failing to save his daughter from disease that pediatric oncology couldn't cure despite his $250,000 in medical debt and endless nights in hospital chairs where fathers learned that love wasn't sufficient protection against cellular mutations. Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes was experiencing her own reckoning as the board of directors demanded explanation for why Sterling Enterprises had systematically failed to recognize employee expertise while maintaining employment practices that discriminated against overqualified applicants whose credentials made HR uncomfortable. "Victoria, the viral video has generated shareholder inquiries about our human resources policies and employee recognition programs," reported Chief Operating Officer Thomas Bradley during their emergency executive session. "Several institutional investors are questioning whether our corporate culture reflects the values we claim to represent in our charitable foundation mission statements." "Thomas, are you suggesting that my personal failure to recognize Julian's background represents systematic institutional problems?" Victoria asked, though her defensive tone revealed growing awareness that her ignorance had been enabled by corporate policies designed to maintain comfortable hierarchies rather than utilize employee expertise. "I'm suggesting that we employed a master craftsman as custodial staff for 7 years, without anyone in executive leadership recognizing his qualifications because our organizational culture treats service workers as invisible unless they create problems," Thomas replied, with the institutional candor that sometimes emerged during crisis management. The conversation forced Victoria to examine whether Sterling Enterprises had been built on her father's values about dignity and artistry or on her own preferences for hierarchy and efficiency that made employee humanity less important than quarterly performance metrics. As both Julian and Victoria faced choices about rebuilding rather than maintaining the protective stances that had insulated them from processing legitimate grief and moral failure. Elena Santos was discovering that Julian's story had resonated with dozens of other sterling employees whose qualifications far exceeded their job classifications because economic circumstances or personal tragedy had forced them into work that didn't match their expertise. Victoria, I've identified 23 employees whose background checks reveal professional credentials that suggest they're overqualified for current positions, Elena reported during their personnel review meeting. Many of them have stories similar to Julian's: medical debt, family tragedy, or career interruptions that forced them into survival employment rather than professional work that matches their training. Elena, why hasn't HR been utilizing these employees' expertise for internal advancement or professional development opportunities? Victoria asked, processing information that suggested institutional waste of human capital alongside moral failure to recognize employee dignity. Because HR screening procedures automatically reject overqualified applicants for most positions, and promotion processes prioritize formal credentials over demonstrated expertise or lived experience, Elena explained, providing evidence that corporate policies had systematically excluded exactly the kind of knowledge diversity that could have prevented both employee underutilization and executive isolation from workers' actual capabilities. The institutional analysis revealed how corporate efficiency priorities created systematic blindness to employee potential while maintaining hierarchies that benefited executive comfort more than organizational effectiveness or moral accountability. Over the following weeks, as commission requests for Julian's work reached 67, with waiting list extending 3 years, while Victoria faced shareholder pressure about employment reform, both participants understood that healing from public humiliation and private grief required accepting that protective isolation had been preventing growth rather than maintaining safety. Mr. Carter, I want to offer you a formal apology that goes beyond the statement I made at the Gala, Victoria said during their private meeting at Sterling Enterprises, her voice carrying vulnerability that executive authority usually suppressed. What I said about your shoes was cruel, but my failure to see you as a complete human being for 7 years was systematic moral blindness that my privilege enabled, Mrs. Hayes. Accepting your apology means forgiving you for cruelty that forced me to publicly share grief I've been protecting for 8 years, Julian replied, his honesty about emotional cost acknowledging that accountability created burdens for victims that perpetrators couldn't fully understand or eliminate through contrition. I understand that my actions caused harm that apology can't fix, Victoria continued, but I want to offer resources for workshop restoration and commission facilitation that could help rebuild what medical debt destroyed if you choose to accept them. Victoria, accepting help means admitting that Maya would want me to create beauty again rather than maintaining grief as monument to her memory, Julian said, using her first name for the first time while acknowledging the moral complexity that characterized decisions about healing when protection had become habitual. Some sacrifices require understanding that maintaining grief as loyalty can become betrayal of the very people we're trying to honor, and that accepting help means trusting that healing doesn't diminish love, but rather allows it to transform into something that benefits communities rather than just preserving private pain. 3 months after Julian had accepted Victoria's resources to restore his Brooklyn workshop, while Sterling Enterprises implemented comprehensive employment reform, recognizing worker expertise regardless of current job classifications, Marcus Dubois arrived from Paris, carrying 7 pairs of Carter original shoes and a proposal that would challenge every assumption about artistry, grief, and the difference between creating for wealthy clients versus creating for communities who needed beauty they couldn't afford. Julian, I have kept these shoes in climate-controlled storage for 15 years because they represent the finest craftsmanship I have ever witnessed, Marcus said as he carefully arranged the pairs in Julian's restored workshop, each one a masterpiece of leather working that demonstrated why his reputation had once transcended fashion to become recognized art. But I have been thinking about your daughter Maya and about whether beautiful things should be preserved in storage or used for purposes that honor the values that created them. Julian studied the shoes with the complex emotions that characterized artisans, viewing work they had created during periods when technical excellence had seemed more important than the personal costs required to achieve it. Each pair represented weeks of focused labor that had occurred while Maya was alive, when his workshop success had felt like achievement rather than time stolen from mortal childhood that would end too soon. Mr. Du Bois, those shoes represent my work before medical debt taught me that artistry means nothing when children die, despite parents' desperate attempts to purchase their survival through bankruptcy and business liquidation, Julian replied, his voice carrying the transformation that grief created in people's understanding of what success actually measured. But Julian, what if artistry could serve purposes beyond wealthy client status signaling? Marcus asked, revealing that his visit involved propositions about purpose rather than just nostalgic appreciation. What if these shoes and your renewed reputation could create opportunities for communities who need beauty precisely because their economic circumstances make it seem inaccessible? The question represented Marcus's own evolution, as 72 years of collecting art had taught him that private acquisition created isolation rather than meaning, and that his wealth had been wasted on preservation rather than shared experience that could benefit communities beyond his personal aesthetic satisfaction. Over the following hours, Marcus explained his vision for transforming Carter Originals from luxury brand serving wealthy individuals into educational program teaching artisanal skills to young people from communities where economic mobility seemed impossible, using Julian's expertise to create pathways from poverty to professional craftsmanship. The workshop would train 15 apprentices annually in advanced shoemaking while providing living wages during training, Marcus outlined, his proposal combining philanthropic resources with Julian's technical knowledge. Graduates would receive tools and business mentorship for establishing independent practices, creating economic opportunities in communities that fashion industry typically exploits rather than elevates. Mr. Du Bois, teaching young people shoemaking means sharing knowledge I developed while failing to notice my daughter was dying, Julian replied, his guilt about past priorities making collaboration feel like celebrating the very obsession that had contributed to missing Maya's early symptoms. Actually, Julian, teaching artisanal skills means honoring Maya by ensuring that other parents' children have economic pathways that don't require choosing between creative careers and financial stability, Marcus countered, reframing Julian's past as resource rather than failure. Meanwhile, Victoria was discovering that employment reform at Sterling Enterprises had revealed systematic expertise among custodial and service staff that could transform both operational effectiveness and corporate culture if properly recognized and utilized through internal advancement and professional development. Victoria, the Employee Recognition Program, has identified specialized skills in engineering, medical research, financial analysis, and artistic design among workers we had been treating as interchangeable labor, Elena reported during their quarterly review of institutional changes. Several employees have advanced degrees or professional certifications that economic circumstances had made inaccessible for traditional career utilization. Elena, what structural changes would be necessary to create advancement pathways that could match employee expertise with organizational needs? Victoria asked. understanding that ethical employment meant creating opportunities rather than just acknowledging that wasted potential existed. We would need mentorship programs, tuition assistance, professional licensing support, and internal promotion tracks that prioritize demonstrated capability over formal credentials, Elena explained, outlining systematic reforms that would transform Sterling Enterprises from hierarchy-maintaining institution to equity-creating organization. The proposal represented evolution from crisis response to proactive culture change, where Victoria's public accountability could become catalyst for organizational transformation that benefited hundreds of employees whose potential had been systematically suppressed through policies that prioritized efficiency over human development. As their alliance expanded through Marcus's apprenticeship vision and Victoria's employment reform, while Julian processed whether teaching could honor rather than betray Maya's memory, all participants understood that institutional change required collaborative commitment to values that transcended individual success or reputation management. "Julian, Maya loved watching you create beautiful things," Elena observed during one of their workshop planning meetings, her perspective as someone who had known Julian throughout his grief providing insight that others couldn't access. Teaching young people to do the same work isn't betraying her memory. It's multiplying the joy she experienced into opportunities for children who need evidence that beauty and economic security don't have to be incompatible. But Elena, every student I train will remind me of Maya at ages she never reached, Julian replied, his honest about grief's ongoing presence, acknowledging that healing didn't eliminate loss, but rather learned to carry it differently. And every student who succeeds will demonstrate that your artistry can create futures instead of just preserving past, Elena countered, offering framework for understanding teaching as generative rather than commemorative. Over the following months, as apprenticeship applications reached 300 from young people across New York, whose economic circumstances had made artisanal careers seem impossible, Julian began recognizing that his expertise could serve purposes beyond personal expression or wealthy client status acquisition. "Mr. Carter, I applied to your program because my mom cleans offices at night, and I want to make things she could be proud of," wrote 16-year-old applicant Destiny Martinez in her admission essay. "She always says that rich people's stuff is better quality, and I want to learn how to make quality things that people like us can afford and own." Idem. The application represented exactly what Marcus's vision had intended. Young people whose circumstances resembled Julian's current position more than his past success, seeking pathways to economic mobility through craftsmanship rather than corporate employment that treated them as interchangeable labor. Some alliances require understanding that healing from tragedy can involve sharing expertise that grief had made us want to hoard, and that honoring lost children sometimes means creating opportunities for living children whose futures could be transformed through knowledge we gained during periods when personal success had felt more important than community service. The crisis that would test every alliance and force final confrontation with grief, privilege, and redemption reached its breaking point when Victoria's board of directors, led by her uncle Richard Hayes, launched a hostile vote to remove her from Sterling Enterprises' leadership, citing the viral scandal and employment reforms as evidence of emotional instability and poor judgment that threatens shareholder value and corporate reputation. "Victoria, your obsession with the custodial workers' hurt feelings has cost this company millions in restructuring expenses and created liability exposure through employment policy changes that previous leadership wisely avoided," Richard announced during the emergency board meeting that would determine whether her reformist vision survived or was eliminated through institutional power that prioritized profit over moral accountability. The accusation was both legally calculated and emotionally manipulative, transforming Victoria's growth into evidence of weakness, while suggesting that recognizing employee humanity represented irrational sentiment rather than ethical business practice that could benefit both workers and long-term organizational effectiveness. Uncle Richard, the employment reforms have improved both retention and operational efficiency, while generating positive media coverage that has increased brand value by 18%, Victoria replied, though her defensive tone revealed awareness that institutional change often triggered resistance from people whose power depended on maintaining hierarchies that her reforms threatened to dismantle. But Victoria, you've compromised our family's reputation by publicly associating sterling enterprises with sob stories about dead children and social justice narratives that alienate our traditional client base, Richard continued, using the cruelty that characterized people whose privilege made them view other humans' tragedies as inconvenient narratives rather than legitimate experiences deserving institutional response. The board confrontation was simultaneously occurring while Julian faced his own crisis, not from institutional power, but from internal doubt about whether teaching apprentices meant moving forward or betraying Maya's memory by accepting that life could contain joy and purpose beyond preserving grief as permanent memorial. "Papa, I think you should teach the kids how to make shoes," came a voice that Julian knew was impossible but heard anyway. Maya's 10-year-old wisdom that had always cut through adult complexity with clarity that transcended her short life experience. The memory wasn't psychosis, but rather the phenomenon that bereaved parents experienced when their children's values became internal compass for navigating decisions that the dead couldn't witness but somehow still seemed to guide through remembered love and projected wisdom. Mr. Carter, the first cohort of 15 apprentices begins training next week, Marcus reported during their workshop preparation meeting, his voice carrying both excitement and concern about whether Julian's emotional readiness matched his technical capability for teaching young people whose futures depended on his ability to share knowledge without drowning them in his unprocessed loss. "Marcus, every young face will remind me of Maya at ages she never reached, and I don't know if I can teach them about creating beauty when my own daughter's life was stolen before she could create anything beyond elementary school art projects and playground memories," Julian admitted, his honesty about ongoing grief acknowledging that 3 months of workshop restoration hadn't eliminated 8 years of protective isolation. "But Julian, perhaps teaching them is exactly how you honor Maya, by ensuring that other children have opportunities to create beauty that economic circumstances won't steal from them the way leukemia stole Maya from you," Marcus replied, reframing teaching as memorial rather than betrayal. Meanwhile, Elena Santos was discovering that Richard Hayes's attempt to remove Victoria involved threatening to expose embarrassing employee backgrounds unless the board voted for leadership change, a blackmail strategy that would reveal Julian's full story, including details about Maya's death that Julian had never publicly shared beyond basic facts about medical tragedy. "Victoria, your uncle is planning to read Julian's complete medical bankruptcy records during tomorrow's shareholder meeting," Elena reported during their emergency consultation, including details about Maya's final weeks that Julian has kept private because they're too painful for public consumption. "He's using a dead child's medical records as blackmail material?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying both horror and recognition that institutional power would weaponize anything, including the most sacred grief, when threatened by reforms that challenged comfortable hierarchies. "Richard is arguing that your emotional response to Julian's situation represents psychological instability that makes you unfit for leadership," Elena explained, revealing how grief could be transformed into evidence of weakness when people in power needed to eliminate threats to their institutional control. The crisis forced Victoria to choose between protecting her position through abandoning reforms or accepting removal while maintaining moral commitments that had already transformed both her understanding and her company's culture in ways that 3 months couldn't reverse regardless of leadership changes. As the shareholder meeting approached with Richard preparing to publicly exploit Maya's death for corporate politics, while Julian prepared to face 15 young apprentices whose hopes depended on his ability to teach despite ongoing grief, both participants understood that their alliance had created vulnerabilities that institutional power would ruthlessly exploit unless they found courage to confront manipulation with transparency that made exploitation impossible. Julian, I need your permission to share your complete story, including Maya's death, at tomorrow's shareholder meeting, Victoria said during their emergency call. Because my uncle is planning to use her medical records as evidence that my employment reforms are based on emotional manipulation rather than legitimate business ethics. Victoria, Maya's death is the most private pain I've ever experienced, and making it public performance for corporate politics feels like final violation of something sacred I've been protecting for 8 years, Julian replied, his voice breaking as he confronted that institutional power would exploit even his daughter's memory when threatened by reforms their alliance had created. I understand that asking you to share this publicly is asking you to sacrifice the last privacy you have about the worst thing that ever happened to you, Victoria acknowledged, but Richard will share it anyway tomorrow. Either with your voice giving it dignity and context, or with his voice reducing it to pathetic sob story that undermines everything we've built together. Some confrontations require understanding that institutional power will exploit even the most sacred grief when threatened, and that protecting reforms sometimes means accepting that private pain must become public testimony when silence would allow cruelty to win through manipulation of the very losses that motivated change. 22 months after the shareholder meeting where Julian had shared Maya's complete story, including her final words asking him to make beautiful things for kids like me who might not get to grow up and make their own beautiful things, while Victoria's reforms survived Richard's removal attempt through overwhelming shareholder support for ethical business practices, Julian Carter stood in his expanded workshop watching the third cohort of apprentices complete their first masterpiece projects, while hundreds of pairs of affordable, artisan-quality shoes prepared for distribution to communities where beauty had always seemed like luxury rather than birthright. The workshop had been transformed, not just physically restored, but spiritually reimagined as space where grief and creation coexisted, where Maya's memory lived through young people's hands, learning crafts that could lift them from poverty while creating objects that brought dignity to customers whose economic circumstances had never before allowed them to own things made with care rather than mass-produced for profit maximization. Mr. Carter, this is the pair I made for my mum, said 18-year-old Destiny Martinez, holding up Oxfords that showed both technical skill and emotional understanding about what it meant to create something beautiful for someone whose life had been spent serving others without receiving beauty in return. She cried when I gave them to her because she said nobody ever made her nothing special before. Julian felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time not from grief alone, but from recognition that Maya's death could create meaning beyond his private loss, that her brief life had somehow seeded something that continued growing through other children's hands, learning to transform leather into love letters their families could wear. At 40 years old, Julian possessed integrated identity that characterized people who had survived devastating loss without allowing it to consume their capacity for joy. His hands still remembered Maya's small fingers helping with stitching, but they also knew the satisfaction of teaching 15 teenagers per year how to create economic independence through artisanal skills that fashion industry had tried to eliminate through cheap labor exploitation and planned obsolescence. "Papa would be proud of what you've built here," Victoria said during her workshop visit, using the intimate term that their collaboration had earned through 22 months of shared commitment to transforming both their institutions and themselves. The employment reforms at Sterling have created pathways for 73 workers to advance into positions matching their expertise. And the model is being replicated by 14 other corporations who attended our business ethics symposium. At 36, Victoria Sterling possessed earned authority that characterized leaders who had been broken by their own cruelty and rebuilt themselves through accountability and sustained institutional reform. Her privilege was still intact, but she had learned to use it for equity creation rather than hierarchy maintenance, understanding that her father's disappointment had been justified but not permanent if she chose growth over comfort. "Victoria, what we've created together isn't just about my shoes or your company," Julian replied, using language that acknowledged their partnership had transcended the viral moment that had forced them together. "It's about proving that institutions can change when people choose accountability over self-protection, even when that choice requires sharing our worst moments as public testimony rather than private shame." The conversation reflected friendship that had been forged through shared vulnerability rather than mutual interest. Victoria had been publicly humiliated by her own cruelty. Julian had exposed his most sacred grief for corporate politics, and both had chosen transformation over retreat into defensive positions that would have been more comfortable but less redemptive. Over the following months, Marcus Dubois was documenting the program's success through research collaboration with NYU's Business School, providing academic validation for models that combined artisanal training with economic mobility, while generating measurable community benefits that transcended traditional vocational education or charitable giving. The Carter Apprenticeship Program has demonstrated that luxury craft skills can be democratized without compromising quality, creating both economic pathways for marginalized youth and affordable access to artisan goods for working-class consumers, Marcus wrote in his case study for Harvard Business Review. Julian and Victoria's partnership illustrates how individual accountability for class-based cruelty can become catalyst for systematic reform that benefits entire communities rather than just resolving personal conflicts through apology and forgiveness. The academic documentation provided evidence that their story had implications beyond individual redemption, offering replicable frameworks for institutional change that could benefit thousands of families whose potential had been suppressed by economic systems that treated artisanal excellence as privilege rather than teachable skill. As their extended family continued evolving through apprentice graduations, Sterling Enterprises' ongoing reforms, and Marcus's international expansion of the training model, all participants understood that healing from both grief and cruelty required sustained commitment to community benefit rather than just personal growth or reputation management. 3 years after the viral moment, Julian stood at Maya's grave on what would have been her 19th birthday, no longer alone, but surrounded by 15 of his former apprentices who had asked to join him because they understood their opportunities had been ceded by her death and wanted to honor the child whose loss had created their futures. "Maya, I don't know if making beautiful things for other kids is what you meant when you told me to create for children like you," Julian said to the gravestone that had been his regular companion for 11 years. "But I think maybe you knew that grief could become something besides just missing you, that it could become purpose that helps families who are struggling like we struggled. So maybe their kids get to grow up and make their own beautiful things, instead of being remembered as might-have-beens." The apprentices stood silent, understanding they were witnessing not just memorial, but testimony about how private loss could generate public good when people chose sharing over hoarding their pain. When institutions chose reform over comfortable hierarchies, when individual stories became collective movements toward equity and dignity. Mr. Carter, Destiny said quietly, my mom wanted me to tell you that the shoes I made her were the first beautiful thing she ever owned that wasn't someone else's hand-me-down or clearance rack leftover. She said they made her feel like she mattered enough for someone to make something special just for her. Some families are created through shared commitment to transforming personal tragedy into community benefit, and the most meaningful legacy often emerges from choosing to honor lost children by creating opportunities for living children whose futures can be changed through knowledge, craft, and institutional reform that proves beauty and dignity should never be limited to those who can afford luxury prices or who were born into privilege that makes excellence seem like natural birthright, rather than teachable skill accessible to anyone whose hands can learn and whose heart can care about quality that outlasts fashion and survives grief.